listening to you, one, people listening to this, CEOs, leaders, founders of companies, might be saying two things which might seem odd to you. One, they might say, gee, what can I do? I'm one person. Or they may say, I'm in the private sector. I'm not a mayor, I'm not a congressman, I'm not a senator, I'm not the president. What can I do? I'm just a guy out here or a lady out here creating some free enterprise opportunity. There's two thoughts that hit me in that I would like you to opine on. One, you are coming back with Dr. King from Norway, where he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong here, you were coming through New York and you wanted to meet with President Johnson. And President Johnson, what Dr. King did, President Johnson really didn't want to see Dr. King because he was fearful that he might have asked for something else. And he was like, I'm done. Like, I've given you one civil rights bill. That's all I can do. And I think Rockefeller loaned you a plane or something to get to D.C. from New York because Johnson gave you a last minute appointment in the residence at night so no one would see you. And you guys had a very interesting interaction with Johnson that where Johnson told you in the King something that was actually misrepresented in a movie, by the way. The facts, you were there. And then Dr. King said something to you when you left that was a defining moment for that other moment you mentioned with John Lewis on the bridge. When you finish with that, because your brain is so crisp, can you also walk them through the role you played in those small towns after Dr. King protested? He did something with the private sector or asked you to do something, which might give these CEOs a sense of how important the private sector's role was in desegregation.
We went to Birmingham because there had been 60 bombings of homes of Black people and no response. Fred Shuttlesworth's church had been bombed on three different occasions. And it was our effort to say that civil disobedience and nonviolence is fine, but it can't be passive. And this was our effort to make it more aggressive. Well, we knew what we needed to fight and what we needed to deal with, but we also had to get the community involved, business community. So as soon as we went there, Dr. King said to me, he said, Andy, do you know any white folks in Birmingham? I said, no, I haven't been to Birmingham before. He said, well, see if you can get to meet some. Now, that was before we started any demonstrations or anything else. And because I'm basically active in the church, I went to the Episcopal Bishop's house, the Carpenter House in Birmingham, where I thought I had met some young people a few years before, and sure enough, that was the place. And they introduced me to the bishop. And I asked the bishop if he would meet with Dr. King, but that what Dr. King was going to ask him to do was to convene meetings with the business community there at the Episcopal Diocesan House, which was a private sort of sacred building that everybody respected. And so while everybody read about the demonstrations in the streets and the dogs and the fire hoses, after that was over, it was my job to walk another couple of blocks back to the Episcopal Church House. And in the afternoon, 4 or 5 o'clock, members of the private sector would come there to meet to discuss how we were going to work to resolve this. And we were actually able to do that in Birmingham. We got 100 businessmen to agree on what needed to be done, and each of them did what they could afford to do in their businesses And we put the community together after the demonstrations and everything had torn it apart. Because part of the demonstrations meant that nobody was buying food or medicine for 90 days. But so there was an attempt to stop capitalism until we could renegotiate the relationships between the customers and the business community, and eliminate some of the burdens and stigma that race had created. But what we found was that personal relationships were really not nearly as bad. It was the state's legal relationships. And so the business community in Birmingham actually agreed to violate the state's laws to desegregate their businesses, and nobody ever complained.
And that's right, because in the 1800s, blacks got the right to vote. In the 1800s, blacks got the right to accommodations and all that stuff after the Civil War. But when Lincoln was assassinated, the jerk that took over as president cut a deal to take all federal troops out of the South so that he might win support from the South. And the removal of the troops from the South allowed, and he basically said to Southern governors, you can do as you like, we won't interfere. And that allowed for 100 years something called Jim Crow laws to creep up in the South, where you had local statutes and in some cases state laws in direct conflict, Alex, with federal law, in direct conflict. And what Dr. King did and Ambassador Young did, and this is why this is so historic, they laid their life on the line to bring federal troops back into the South, along with the Justice Department, along with media cameras, along with...
Well, we brought the media cameras and the Justice Department. We really didn't want federal troops. But what we found was that when 100 businessmen in almost any city will agree to anything, everybody falls in line.
That's right.
And I remember not long after that, I was making that same statement in New York, and Harry Oppenheimer was there from South Africa. And he came up to me and he said, you talk about this in the South. What do you think would happen in South Africa? Do you think 100 businessmen could help change South Africa? I said, absolutely. I said that business and government are partners, but really the ones with the money are the senior partners. And government usually follows what the business community thinks is best for business. And sure enough, he invited me to come to South Africa to make that statement. And by that time, I had become the ambassador to the United Nations, and I did make the statement. And we did help South Africa through the Chamber of Commerce bring its businesses together to negotiate Nelson Mandela getting out of jail and creating a peaceful path to majority rule. I think most will agree that with all the problems that have come with majority rule, that still South Africa is stronger business-wise today than it has ever been. And that there is a good relationship between business and government. And they work more on the problems together than being against each other.